So, CypherCon. Welcome, everybody. My name is Dan Creed. I work in the infrastructure security group and product security assessment and analysis for a very large social media and metaverse company that shall remain nameless thanks to our attorneys. We'll dive right in here. So, the conversation today, and this is a conversation, not a talk, so feel free to ask questions afterwards, and keep in mind some questions if you have them. But the graphs that I have on the screen here show the cost relative to fixing bugs. All vulnerabilities at the heart of it are bugs. In a shift left mentality, so starting at the coding or design phase, when you're gathering requirements for the product you're building, up into after release, if you follow the curve on both graphs, you'll see that, at a minimum on some estimates, once you get live in production and a bug is found, it costs roughly 150 to 640 times as much to fix the bug after a product has gone live, as opposed to fixing it during the design or even early on in the implementation phase. Particular company I work for, we have a pretty mature ecosystem. We estimate that we've probably driven that cost factor down to about 30 times. So what does it take to get there and build infrastructure at scale, security in this way? It starts really with good security lifecycle and vulnerability management lifecycle, and starting to operate into a shift left security mindset. For those of you that are new to shift left security, you're moving where you're finding the vulnerability, where typically after a product is live, you read about it in the Wall Street Journal. That's your exploited vulnerability to prevent it, and down that life cycle where prevented is at the other end of the spectrum, in that you're actually finding the bug during the design phase before a single line of code is written or a system is deployed. Then you have auto found, human found, and externally found sitting in the middle of that. So let's start with prevented. What do we do to prevent bugs like this from getting in there? First, we'll talk about scale. So the scale that I'm talking about, we have approximately 8 million servers. Our average network egress traffic hovers around 200 terabits per second, pumping 28,000 gigabytes per second of data to between 2 and 3 billion users. So we start with a security review program that looks at things comprehensively, starts at the design phase, typically with a threat model. For those of you who are new to threat modeling, threat model is the concept of before a line of code has been written or a system deployed, going through and identifying the risks, the trust boundaries, and then potential mitigations to that threat. This is where you get your biggest cost savings from, if you can find them at this phase. It's typically a null gain cost, or at most 1x, because you're literally designing a more secure product that this bug is never going to exist, which ironically enough also makes it the hardest to quantify, because how do you quantify nothing in something that never exists? And the other key component of that would be having baseline security standards. This is one area that in the industry we're seeing a lot of movement. If you look at all the different NIST frameworks and different frameworks in general that are coming into IT and security in general, this is driven by the fact that security really has been treated as a second-class citizen and not really an engineering disciple. You'll still find many computer science programs referring to coding as software development. And I'm going to encourage everyone here, it's not software development, it's software engineering. It needs to be treated as an engineering discipline. You'll notice when companies like Ford or Airbus build a plane or a car, that they have standards that guide their safety and security practices to ensure that they have a baseline level of security and software. Now, would you put your wife and children in a car or a plane that was designed by a group of engineers like us who never thought about safety and security? Of course you wouldn't. So like, as pervasive as software has become in our lives, why do we continue to build software like this? And this is largely a problem that starts in our schooling system as well. Very few schooling systems teach threat modeling and security fundamentals to the point that, you know, if you're a computer science major or in school and learning programming, if you write code with a bug in it, your instructor should fail that assignment and have you try again. Security is everybody's responsibility. The security team that I work on, we have one of the most distributed models, and it also allows, one of the important things is like, how do you scale your program? We have almost 80,000 employees, of which over 40,000 of that are software developers. If we didn't pass that ownership and make software engineering and security and safety a part of that discipline, we would not be able to scale, especially given the talent shortage today. So next on that scale, you move to AutoFound. This is another up and coming area that companies are getting better at. You're starting to see a little bit of an emergence of AI in. Within our company, at every single diff that is submitted, we do linting, we do static and dynamic analysis tool. We have the capabilities of fuzzing and unit testing at every diff, as well as a manual review process that comes later in the pipe that we'll talk about. But you would be surprised at the effectiveness of this program. We originally set out with a goal of being able to automatically find, or during the design phase, 50% of the vulnerabilities. Now, we have approximately, on average, 114,000 commits every single month to our code base. Of that, we are now at the point where we're actually changing our metrics around a bit, because we're finally to the point where we're exceeding on a regular basis that 50% mark. To put this in perspective, in the last half of 2021, we found approximately 10,000 bugs, of which 6,880 were automatically found by our linting and fuzzing, with the remaining being found during our human, and a very small amount found that actually made it through that process. Our static and dynamic analysis tools we built from the ground up. They're purpose-built for our social networking company. And recently, PISA, which is the static analysis tool that we use for Python static analysis, actually won an award from the IEEE. Next, as we progress down the stack, we move into diff reviews and code reviews at the human found phase. Now this is where it starts to get expensive. Once you get into the human found, I mean, in an average company, you're looking at a 30 to 40 times increase in the cost to repair that bug, because at this point, code has been written, systems have been deployed, and for all intents and purposes, the bug exists. And it will either end up being found by a human, it'll be unfound, which is on the rise, or it will be exploited later in life, at which point the cost really explodes. As part of our diff review process, after all of the automation goes on, every diff is then sent into a queue. Then, as I said, we have over 40,000 developers, that a second set of eyes must review that diff and approve that that diff has been reviewed and cleared to land, at which point then it's sent to the central repository and distributed to our fleet of servers. Externally found. Now we're getting into really dangerous territory, because now the product is actually accessible to the world. In this, we have a private bug bounty program, which again, I would encourage companies to do. There are a couple of vendors here as well that offer this kind of service, in which with your private bug bounty, you're essentially paying a select group of people to basically operate as a hacker from an outside, similar to a public bug bounty, but this one private. And our red team as well, red teaming, if you don't know the difference between a red team and a pen test, please come see me after the session and let's have a talk. They're two very different things, and it's one of those all bourbons are whiskey, but not all whiskeys are bourbons kind of thing. And our red team focuses on everything. We're in the unique position that we manufacture a lot of our own hardware in the data center, as well as the operating system in which our switches and our core infrastructure network gear runs on. So we have to have a very comprehensive red team that can cover both. Most recently, we had one person that was desoldering the chip off of a programmable logic controller in one of the HVAC units in a data center and intercepting the firmware, decrypting it, and supplanting it with a malicious firmware, to, on the AppSec side of things, having people who are well steeped deeply in code, including where we have a particularly steep learning curve because a lot of our stuff was bespoke and written before things like Kubernetes existed. So our containerization is all custom. Unfound, it's interesting to look at the increase in the number of unfound bugs, especially at the hardware layer, which is really tricky that it popped up. I'm sure many of you have heard of things like Spectre, and a large number of CPU vulnerabilities have been found, including ones that existed in CPUs for a good 5-10 years. Generally unfound, are those ones that you hope won't bite you, but you never know. And I use Spectre and Meltdown as prime examples of how these can bite you in the past. And like in general, like I said, with hardware, it gets really tricky because it could be anything from, where hopefully you have a programmable logic controller, ASIC, that makes things easy, but that's not always the case, and sometimes it's baked into the raw silicon. So to combat some of the unfound, I found it effective to set up code walking programs in which you set up small rewards for your software engineers, to take a certain amount of time and allow for a certain amount of time a week to go through randomly and walk through various pieces of code, as well as setting up specific targets and prioritizing like your top risky things in small bite-sized chunks and asking people, kind of having a target hit list to do code walking through. Exploited. These are the ones that make the Times and the Wall Street Journal, and these are the ones you do not want to see yourself on CNN for. It's another big area which many companies put a whole lot of focus into. The more traditional response of let's put up more firewalls, let's put up a WAF, and then they tend to substitute on incident response and detection, which is surprising given that detection times still are measured oftentimes within our industry in weeks, months, even sometimes years. Whenever you give a hacker more time on target, the more damage they're going to do, which is really surprising given ransomware and the increase in ransomware and what it can do. If you weren't aware of this fact, you should be, but most ransomware attacks live in the life cycle of take weeks to months to actually set up. So when you're reading about those ransomware attacks on the news, it's generally not somebody who got in and did something in a couple days. It actually started probably weeks to months ago, in which a lot of lateral movement points were established, and they wormed their way into a larger part of the enterprise, which in some ways ties back a little bit with your red team. And if your red team is not objective-based, they should be. Typical tactic for our red team would be to set them up with a specific goal in mind of, okay, so our goal for this operation is to get domain admin or root, depending on your segmentation, it could be scoped to the whole organization on down to a specific critical group of servers, depending on your industry and vertical. Another big thing in the meantime to detection where a lot of people fail is not taking advantage of low-cost, human nature deception systems. A lot of people look at this as dirty play. I can assure you it's not. Hackers do this all the time in social engineering, and it costs nothing. If your password policy is 12 characters, create an account with 11. With the sole purpose of monitoring that, because if somebody's running a password crack against you, guess which account is the first one that gets hit. Then do things that play on risk versus reward, and depending what vertical you're in, set up a fake account for Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos or somebody who, when a hacker hits that system, the risk versus the reward is just too great that you know that they're going to hit it, that all it's doing at that point then is it's super low cost, and it's serving as a virtual tripwire or a landmine that goes boom of, hey, somebody's looking around at things they shouldn't. Then moving on to mean time to response. Again, response is measured, it's often really slow. Do tabletop exercises, drill your team. The military has a mantra in which they train like they fight, so that when they fight it's automatic and they don't have to think about it. And you want to make it painful, you want to make it real. I love getting in conversations with executives and stuff on well, should I allow this pen test or this red team engagement on my production systems, or during the middle of the night or during the business day, when business critical stuff is going on. And having that conversation with your executive, that's often tough. Do you really think that the hackers sit and ask me what time it's okay to attack my systems? Of course they don't. You have to operate on the same rules and parameters that they do, or you're setting yourself up for failure. So focus on response. The last thing I wanted to cover as far as exploited bugs is we also operate a program called Defense Through Offense that is geared specifically towards red team and our more junior security engineers, to give them the opportunity to work with the red team and actually learn techniques, tactics, and procedures. Splitting the team in half, where basically half will go and work with the offensive side, half will work with the incident response team. And you'll do an objective-based scenario that could start at a tabletop exercise to a live fire drill that then runs them through and practices from start to end an event of not just the red team, but coordinating with that with a more realistic scenario of from red team to incident recovery. So key points. 1, security is a life cycle. Early discovery does lower the cost through remediation, and it reduces technical debt, which is really important when you think about it. I'm not sure how many software developer types we have in here, but show of hands, who likes to work on old, broken, legacy code? Okay, we got one weirdo in the back.
And I charge by the hour.
I charge by the hour is right, as opposed to, you get new students and we do a lot of hiring, and we see this even in our recruiting cycles and hiring, nobody wants to work on the infrastructure, nobody wants to work on the legacy systems. They want to work on the cool new metaverse. They want to work on the cool stuff that, this is going to be in front of all my friends and family and, 2 million users. Early discovery of this and threat modeling and getting this stuff out and getting it right in the design phase, not only is it going to give you a more secure product, but you're going to have less tech debt because you thought about it in advance. Another topic I didn't cover about that, there are common factors and myths that have been associated with threat modeling that I want to dispel right now. 1, you do not have to be a security expert to threat model. We want security, we want software engineers, people who aren't traditional security to do this. And that's often the first thing. Well, I have a security department, that's their job. I don't need to know how to secure my systems. Every animal on this planet threat models, whether you realize it or not. Every single one of you, when you got behind the wheel of a car When you lock your doors at night, you did a threat model. Threat model is simply the process of identifying a risk, identifying a trust boundary, and coming up with a mitigation to it. So, you lock your doors at night. Why do you lock your doors at night? Because you've evaluated the risk of getting robbed, which, okay, I'm gonna get robbed. How can I prevent that? What's the trust boundary? The trust boundary is door, and there are people on the other side of the door who are nefarious and might wanna rob me because I've got valuable stuff here. So what's your mitigation? Lock the door. And this kind of exercise, threat modeling doesn't have to be heavyweight and complex. These frameworks like Stride and Octave and Pasta, it's similar to Agile, where if anybody here has experienced like implementing a packagitized Agile framework for their company, like CA Safe or whatever, like it becomes heavyweight and bulky fast because that's read the Agile manifesto. That's not what Agile is. Agile isn't something you put in a box in a product, and neither is threat modeling. If you read the threat modeling manifesto, threat modeling should be designed to work with your development teams and their development lifecycle, how they develop. So don't buy into this whole notion that it has to be heavyweight. We have plenty of threat modeling going on in our very large organization that is done via Quip and Google Doc. We're trying to get away from that because it's hard to get metrics out of that, but it's done and it works for those development teams. It's up to us to provide them with better tooling then that enables that same piece of workflow. A holistic security program doesn't blindly rely on annual penetration tests. Another fun show of hand questions. How many people out here have worked with a company who solely rely on their annual pen test as being their bellwether of whether or not their perimeter is secure or not? A pen test it's good for identifying deficiencies in your perimeter, but it's not how the real world operates. A hacker is not constrained by time. A pen test generally is. Pen tests tend to go wide and scan for a variety of things. A real hacker doesn't. They have an objective in mind, and generally that objective is get into your business, move around your systems laterally, and how do I monetize this? So, having a whole life cycle and a secure development life cycle like this also helps reduce security from being seen as an obstacle, but rather as a business enabler. How is it a business enabler? What company doesn't want to end up, on CNN or in the paper? What company doesn't want to build more secure products? Executives, you see more and more CISOs are getting a seat at the board and at the executive level because companies are sick of seeing their products be poorly designed and breached because someone never bothered to stop and think about how could this be broken and adapting more of an adversarial mindset when designing it. This is probably the most important one to me, is build security into your engineering culture. I can't say it enough. It starts with our education system. I'm 48 years old. When I was a kid, computers were still relatively new. What my kids can do now, computers are a mainstream part of their life. Security needs to get the same way. It should be taught in school. When you're in college, you should be able to, specialize in it in building a product, just like any other engineering discipline. And there should be standards developed for what does good software look like from a safety and security standpoint. Lastly, finding a vulnerability for your development team fixes the product today. Teaching them to find vulnerability fixes the products of today, tomorrow, and the future. Yeah. So why does this matter? Again, our scale is 8 million servers, network egress 222 terabits, 28,000 gigabytes per second, 3 billion users, 114,000 commits a month, 847 million lines of code, and almost 10,000 bugs in the second half of 2021. So imagine now trying to scale a security program for this where you have 40,000 developers without having that automation and that design engineering culture in place. Just think of how many security engineers we would have to hire, and then think of the sheer shortage of talent in even finding that, let alone funding that. So I'll pull up too, I put in my notes here, I want to pull up, I actually did a little math behind this as well. There we go. So, just play out a little scenario with me. Say a vulnerability caught during the design phase cost roughly $500 in developer and security time. So from the graphs we showed earlier, the average finding and remediating of that is variable estimated between, we'll say 1 in 40 if it's caught prior to launch, as much as 640% caught after the launch. So for us, what this would have equated to in the second half of 2021 is we know that we found 6,880 bugs automatically, which that would have cost $3.4 million to fix. Now, if you figure that those went through and made it to the manual phase, let's figure a conservative 20 times the cost. Now you're looking at $69 million to fix. And now let's say that those bugs weren't found until the launch of the product. And let's again be real conservative and say 100-time cost. Now you're looking at $344 million to fix those bugs. It changes the cost multiple of that original $500 cost of finding it during the design phase is now $50,000 a bug. So that's the importance of shifting left and how we approach it and building an infrastructure security program at scale. Any questions? Do we have any what?
Compliance, like some sectors have PCI.
We do have some PCI requirements with our global footprint. We have GDPR. We also have an FTC order that we have to comply with. And with our F2, which is our Facebook Financials or Novi offerings, now we're starting to get more into the financial realm. We'll have more financial compliance issues in the future.
Are you baking that into your pipeline?
We're baking it into the pipeline where we can, but the compliance piece of that is tough. So some of that's still in works and some of it's still new. I mean, people are well aware that we did attempt to start some crypto offering and it was not greeted well, especially by the government and media. So our financial piece still tends to be small on the regulation side, but given the growth of the metaverse, and that's really going to be funded and fueled largely by microtransactions and more of a storefront approach, I would anticipate that there's probably going to be more regulation around that. And I mean, the whole metaverse and business model is a whole nother interesting conversation and like what that looks like financially.
Now, you had mentioned that all of your code was built in-house before a lot of Kubernetes and stuff. Are you guys starting to switch to Kubernetes, or are you still going to maintain
We are not. Our legacy code is just so coupled tightly to what we build and so performant for what we need at the scale that we're at. Our containerization, orchestration, and automation uses a system called Tupperware. Like I said, it was built before Kubernetes existed, but it's all highly containerized. So like a developer in our environment can spin up a container with a full copy of the repo in about 45 seconds to a minute and have full access to the repos that they need to develop on, all container based with on a timed life cycle of orchestration. So like that dev container will last for a finite period of time that they specify when they check it out, or if there's no use on it for 30 days, it's automatically destroyed.
So when each of these 40,000 developers come in, are they having to learn your system from scratch, or does it follow similar principles?
The first 6 to 8 weeks for all engineers, and it doesn't matter if you're Zuck or if you're a new college graduate, go through an engineering boot camp where they learn our core systems. But like if you have the foundations of like modern cloud architectures and technologies, it's not too steep a learning curve. It's more of just learning the nuances.
So you put the people through a boot camp to help assimilate them in the way you do things?
Resistance is futile.
Well, that would help drive the culture that you guys are trying to drive in order to enable this, right?
It does very much, and like our training is very robust. I mean, we have within different tracks, different functionalities of internal academies that you can take to focus on specific areas. Within the engineering boot camp, depending on what your job role and interest is, you can focus on a specific track. And I mean, it's 6 to 8 week training course, and boot camp is pretty intensive.
So maybe that's a key point too, like the training that you guys offer helps build the culture you need in order to enable that.
It does most definitely. I mean, the three things that drive our culture really is, I mean, the training, the tooling, and the process. I mean, that is what has enabled us to scale to the size that we have. Without that, we'd fall flat.
If I work for a bank and trying to enable a shift left culture, it would be impossible. It would be impossible. Resistance is everything.
Yeah, financial, and the more regulation you get, the more difficult that can get.
That's where I started, yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, some of it, like I said, is engineering discipline. Like overall, I'd like to see the industry kind of adopt, a building code where there's a national building code for software to at least define what good looks like, and then, companies could take the pieces that are good and apply to them out of that, and then, have a variance process by which they come up with their own code and, own sections that would apply to their unique business unit or products as well. But I think there's far too little good guidance out there.
Everyone develops their own bespoke solution, their own code blueprint and timing.
They do, and they tend to focus on different things and different aspects of their wants and needs. Like anybody who I'm sure most of you have read through at least one NIST standard or another, I mean, the whole military guidance and mission readiness, and like you can see like there's really good stuff in it, but it's also very geared towards a specific audience and a specific vertical. These are hard problems to solve.
Since you ended early, why don't you talk about your difference between red team and penetration?
Sure.
So you brought it up, you might as well just cover it for the extra time here.
I will. So in general, penetration testing, when you do your average penetration test, and like not all of them are equal, some are good, some are bad, but like over the years I've done, I don't even want to guess, but it's well into the thousands of penetration tests, probably tens of thousands over the years, as well as many, many, many red team engagements. So I know the difference well, where, with a typical penetration test, you're running a lot of scanning of the perimeter and a lot of web stuff that's broad and wide of where, like, I'm gonna run Burp Suite and Nikita. I might focus on one or two areas. And like my goal is to really scan a list of targets or a list of environments and provide you with, okay, these are the vulnerabilities that I see, this is how I would get in, versus a red team is very much objective based and focused. And a good example is we just did a red team engagement where that was the target. Okay, imagine I'm an insider, I'm a contingent worker, I have a laptop from the company, and my objective is to obtain domain admin. The two approaches, the way that you handle those are very different. A red team engagement, because it's with a specific objective in mind, is very more laser focused and less on, hey, let's scan the whole perimeter, let's provide a wider report of specific targets, It's my target is to get domain admin, and it doesn't matter how I do it. So, you know, you can craft up rules of engagement on them, but generally I discourage companies from doing that, because nor do the hackers. Like, I work in an industry and for a size company that, like, to think that we don't have state-leveled sponsored people that have been hired by the company in our organization would be extremely naive. I guarantee you we do, Google does, Amazon does, you know, anything should be fair game. And like, people in our industry tend to think of technology first, because at heart we're all technologists and geeks, and they don't think about the psychological aspects, which I had an interesting conversation at lunch with a up and coming college student about the fact that I asked him point blank, so, you know, in the last couple of years, you've seen this huge proliferation and increase in ransomware and phishing attacks. Okay, I asked him more in depth generically, but I'm gonna see who knows the answer to this really here, at least in my opinion. One word, what's the cause of that? It's Bitcoin. The ability to anonymize and anonymize your monetization of that attack vector has now made it from a risk versus reward when you think of the psychological fact of it, of now I can exploit a company, I can blackmail them, and I don't have to worry about the money being traced back to me and being easy to intercept like physical currency is. That's really what has driven, in large, the huge increase attack in ransomware. And you're seeing this not just in ransomware, but in anything that can be monetized through an extortion type attack vector. We've seen the distributed denial of service attacks of, you know, hey, give us X amount of Bitcoin or we're gonna hit you with a DDoS attack and bring you down to your knees, to ransomware, to phishing, I mean, and all these prey on the whole psychological aspect that we tend not to think about. I'll give you another example here. Was working for a company, and a buddy calls me up, and like, he was in the operations side of things. He's like, dude, like, you've been doing like Unix a long time and Linux and stuff, right? Like, we've got this Linux server that's just like pounding on our database, and like nobody can figure out what it is. Can you help me track it down? So like immediately they get a team together, and this team like immediately like, let's get on the switch, let's find out the MAC address, let's trace the cable, you know, to the physical server. And I'm like, whoa, guys, hold on a second. Like, what's the name of this server? Oh, well, it's like lgc-linux. I'm gonna anonymize this, companyname.com. I'm like, okay, so like, what do you know from that piece of information? Well, we know the server name. Okay, well, like, what's your naming standard? Oh, well, we use airport codes. Okay, well, what airport code is LGC? Oh, well, that's weird. We don't have any location near LGC. Okay, don't you think that's odd? Well, yeah, but like, what do you think it means? Okay, I want you to think real long and hard about this. When you write code, when you annotate it, do you type out your full name? Well, no, I use my initials. Do you think that 3-letter code might be somebody's initials? Why don't you check with your developers and see if they have anybody with that initials? Oh, no, we don't have any developers that have those initials. Did you check with the red team? No. Hey, you guys got anybody there with the initials LGC? Oh, yeah, Landon's initials are like LGC. Ding, 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 ding. 5 minutes, problem solved. Again, where they wanted to dive in and like, getting the MAC address, tracing the cable probably would have taken them about 2 hours of time. That I solved the problem for them in 5 minutes just by thinking about the psychology about it. You know, same thing like when you're evaluating, because it's not a matter of if your system gets breached, it's when, which is why I put a big focus on detection. You know, the people that you really need to be scared about, if you get some dude in your system, like, hacker comes in, sets up, you know, an access point and like sets up a user account like Han Solo or some, you know, sci-fi thing. That dude is in there for fun. He's in there to explore. He's in there kiddie scripting. Yes, he can do some damage. Don't underestimate that. But his motivations in general aren't particularly serious. Now you have some dude who goes in there and, you have a bunch of servers named 001, 002, 003. Oh, now there's an 004 on here. That's the dude you lose sleep over. Because he's put the thought into how am I going to normalize my traffic? How am I going to hide this? How am I going to be the wolf in sheep's clothing as much as he possibly can? He's thinking about the psychology and like, dude, some of the things are just scary. So like the social media company I work for and stuff, like gets a total bad rep about this. And again, like people don't think about this. Like this blows people's mind. In my own family, like, oh my God, you work for them? I heard about them on the news. How can you work for that place? Okay, dude, like, Mom, where did you hear that information? Oh, well, I heard it on TV, on the news. Okay, so you heard it on the news. How does that news station, it's owned by a television station, how do they generate their revenue? Well, commercials. Well, that's advertising, right? Well, yeah. Well, who's their biggest competitor? Oh. So you don't think that they have any bias to throw us under the bus every chance that they get? Of course they do. It helps their bottom line. There's so much psychology and risk versus reward to this that people don't think about in our industry that like can make all the difference in the world in how you just view and approach problems. And like the nastiest case I've ever seen of like how people switch tactics and use psychology. So there was a hospital system in Detroit that a group of hackers got in there, compromised the electronic health record system. And so like, I mentioned to you earlier, the really dangerous hackers are the ones who want to monetize this. And like this is a good use case of like, oh my God, when we designed this system, we never thought of how this would be abused against us. They took the electronic medical records, identified terminal patients, got them hooked on drugs, and agreed to continue supplying with them drugs provided they would sign over a life insurance policy with them as the beneficiary.
Wow. Wow. People suck.
Huh?
People suck.
Oh, they do. People are always the weakest link. People ask me, why haven't you solved the cybersecurity problem yet? Well, it's the same reason you still have police. The same reason there's a war going on in Ukraine right now. People do stupid, unexpected, mean things. Like, there's always bad apples in every bushel. It's just the way life works in society. If we ever fix that problem, sure, then it'll be fixed. Until then, we all have job security. It's just crazy stuff going on in the world and in cybersecurity. So now I'm curious, who else has a crazy security story? What's the craziest thing you've ever seen?
Yeah. I don't even know how you top that one.
Oh, that's, get into the industrial military complex, better ones than that. Okay, thanks everybody for your time, and thanks for coming to CypherCon.